Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the last day of the conference. We've had a great week. So I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today, the Whadjuk Noongar people. We pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. I come from Finland, but I have called Perth home since 2009. It's truly a beautiful place to live and work. I had all my kids, 3-year-old twins and a 5-year-old, who you can see in the image there, in Perth, and I have had the great privilege of studying dolphins in Manjugurdup in Mandurah, the meeting place, and another sea country locations around Australia, including Wajimap, Rottnest Island, which I hope many of you will have a privilege to visit if you haven't already. I have the fondest memories from my own childhood of attending conferences very similar in structure to this one. As kids, we used to have our own conference program, and we made friends while our parents enjoyed the conference program. We had excursions and incursions. So I clearly did not follow in the footsteps of my parents, but I really did feel welcome and loved on in these conferences, and it has greatly enriched my life. Children matter, and families matter. In my first rather amazing society conference in Tampa, Florida in 2011, I really remember thinking about where's all the kids? And since then, I've prayed and planned for a shift, not only our conferences, but a culture in our community and in our society that is not just inclusive, but genuinely welcome to families. Some of our brightest minds and greatest potential for discovery and advancement in marine mammal science are women and men, people who equally want to pursue their career and a rich family life. Being a mother is my greatest joy. My kids are the most important people to me. The only way I was able to be part of organizing this conference is because of my husband, Ross. He looked after them so I could be here to serve you. So we invited you families, I'll collect myself. And I truly hope that we made you feel welcome. And I hope that the effort that we put in here will be built on for future conferences. So before we begin with today's plenaries, I would like to remind you to be kind and respectful to each other for one more day, at least. Then you can go wild. We have our DEI representatives who you can spot with the rainbow ribbon on them. If you have any concerns, you can talk to them or go to the registration to ask for support. After we break from this plenary session, I will change the slide. We will have a half an hour coffee and tea break. Please check your email on how to we will return to our final concurrent sessions at 11. So check your email how you can consent, whether you're allowing us to share your presentations on the app for the next 60 days. After the sessions, we'll break for lunch, and at 1:30 we will gather back here in the theater for the closing ceremony, awards, and our final plenary. We will then have the general members meeting, and we really encourage everyone, all the members, to attend. So do not miss out on the opportunity to learn what is happening and how you can become more active and involved. And of course, we're going to hear about the next conference host, about Puerto Rico. The poster and exhibitor hall will be closed at 1:30. So make sure you have viewed the posters and talked to the exhibitors you wanted to connect with. And then if you want to keep your poster, please remove it by 3 p.m. And then tonight, those of you who are attending the farewell barbecue at Fraser's Restaurant in Kings Park, if you received an email last night that we have a ticket for you, if you were on the waiting list, please pay for it before 11 a.m. Otherwise, we will move it to the next person on the waiting list, which is long. Buses will start loading at 6 p.m. at the plaza here at the conference center, and then return buses start going from Fraser's back here, or to the hotel, sorry, at 9:30, and the die-hard partiers can join me in the last bus at 11:30. So you can scan a QR code. I'm so sorry, I forgot to advance that. You can scan the QR code for instructions how to get there if you're not going to take the bus. So I now want to welcome Simon Allen to the stage to introduce our first plenary of the day.
G'day everyone. It's Simo. Come on, Doug. I thought we were closer. Fresh off the back of his incredible session chairing performance, I'd like to introduce Nick. He has led Australia's Antarctic program. He's been Australia's chief Antarctic scientist. He's currently Vice Chair of the International Whaling Commission, as well as serving as Australia's IWC Commissioner. Nick is representing the Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment and Water today, and he'll be presenting this plenary, Are the Whaling Wars Really Over? Science, Culture, Politics and Diplomacy in an Evolving International Whaling Commission. Please join me in welcoming Nick Gales.
Thank you very much, Simon, and good morning, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks very much to the organisers of this wonderful conference for allowing an opportunity for me to present this talk, and thanks also for bringing your wonderful conference to Australia for the first time. I hope all of you love this country while you're here. I want to start by adding my voice to those who have acknowledged and pay our respects to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation. I want to particularly highlight and thank our early presentations at the start of this conference from Chelsea and Jody, which were extraordinary presentations where they shared with us the relationships their peoples have with the animals that we all study. I can think of no finer opening of a conference that I've ever been to, so thank you very much to those two women in particular and the organisers for encouraging them to be there for that to happen. I also want to briefly, but importantly, acknowledge and pay my respects to the whale hunting peoples of the high Arctic, a world away from here, but their story will be part of the presentation I give you now. The story I'm telling is arguably the defining story of the modern conservation movement among non-Indigenous peoples. In common with our conference theme, Fishing for Change, I'll tell you a story of historic human excess, belated but effective conservation action, and I hope a relatively optimistic story of how the IWC can find its way through a plethora of issues and challenges to find its way in the modern context. And to all of you, dedicated scientists out there, this is also a story of how science slowly but surely, if not always perfectly, exerts its influence in the form of policy, management and law. Oh, I better press buttons here. So, to quote Confucius, study the past if you would define the future. And so I take you back to the start of the 20th century when ships were finally fast enough to keep up with blue whales and fin whales, and the period of enormous industrial whaling in the high seas began. The high seas, in the 1930s, there were attempts by people to constrain the rate at which the whaling occurred, and two conventions were formed. Neither were successful. Neither could assuage essentially the, goodness me, I can't even read my own writing here. could assuage the rate at which whales were taken by people. They were treated as a limitless resource, and it's a story we've heard so very many times. By the 1940s, industrial whaling had killed 1.1 million whales globally. Shore-based stations were struggling because they depleted the whales in the areas at which their catch boats could get to. And by that time, Antarctic blue whales, once enormously abundant, had been reduced by about 90%. In 1946, the convention that guides IWC today was created, the International Convention for the Regulation of Whaling. It brought new hope, as it was perhaps the first ever convention that had a primary focus on conservation, albeit to enable a prosperous whaling industry. 15 whaling nations negotiated, signed on, and created that. And I want you just to remember the numbers. The number of parties who are signatories to this convention is important, and I'll come back to that. The convention, though, had an inauspicious start. The factory ships were being built at that time, and that expanded whaling from the constraints of shore-based whaling stations to the entire oceans, and of course right around the very remote Southern Ocean. The IWC simply failed to constrain catches. Without an agreed and effective science-based limit to catches, uncertainty was exploited by the industry and the politicians. We all know that story in so many realms. A further 2 million whales were taken between 1940s and 1980s, extraordinary. And the blue whales by that time were reduced to well under 1% of their original abundance. So the Save the Whales campaign of the 1970s swept across much, not all, but much of the globe and heralded a new and effective movement through which civil society could influence and change government policies. The genesis of the modern environment movement was really born. Many IWC member countries shifted their whaling policy. In 1972, the UN Conference on the Human Environment in Stockholm proposed a 10-year moratorium on whaling, and a decade later, finally, the IWC established a complete ban on commercial whaling to take effect from 1985-86. So at 40 years of age, the convention paused commercial whaling. The graph is a dramatic representation of the effect of that one action. You can see the almost complete stop of commercial whaling at that point. You can see the enormous scale, the disastrous scale at which whaling had occurred through that industrial whaling period of the 20th century. You can see the sequential depletion of the blue whales, then the fin whales, then the humpbacks and seis, and then finally the Antarctic minke whales. You can also see that in the last 40 years, the last 40 post-moratorium years, the scale of commercial whaling has been extraordinarily small compared to the period prior to the moratorium. In 1982, only 5 countries were commercial whaling, so at the time of the decision: Iceland, Japan, Korea, Norway, and the then Soviet Union. Norway and Iceland continued their whaling soon after the moratorium was in place through an objection in the case of Norway, a legal, normal instrument in the convention, and Iceland through perhaps a more controversial reservation when they left and then rejoined the IWC. The Soviet Union and Korea ended their commercial whaling period at that time. And the moratorium has no end date, but was due for review after 10 years. And by 1982, IWC membership had grown from the original 15 to 39 countries. The membership numbers are important. Only a small minority of members of were actually whaling countries. But the numbers not only show the consequence of global politics, rallying countries to support your cause, they also show that whales are part of the global commons, which are the foundation of modern society and the global economy. That's key to all high seas conservation efforts. Japan abided by the moratorium, but it then started to conduct whaling under special permit. IWC parties are allowed to issue themselves special permits under what's called Article 8 of the Convention to take whales for the purposes of scientific research. The scientific whaling had historically been around exploring new whaling grounds and had been modest in scale and scope. Japan started a multi-decade series, which were unprecedented in scale, of scientific whaling in the Southern Ocean. Immediately the moratorium was put in place, and some years later in the North Pacific. And thus the modern whale wars commenced, and images of Greenpeace and Sea Shepherd kept the attention of whaling in the Southern Ocean for many years. For the next 25 years, scientific whaling is massively contested and polarises the IWC membership. The IWC Scientific Committee, despite huge endeavours by many who are here, struggled to communicate the balance of evidence on each side of the debate. The process was political and deadlocked. It was hard for the scientists who were arguing for and against it, and many of the members of the Scientific Committee of the IWC simply withdrew from engaging in what was seen as a deadlocked and politicised process. The parallels with tobacco science and climate science are obvious in this case. We know that politics exploits the uncertainties that are an essential part of our normal scientific process and can give false impressions that there is a consequential evidence-based divide among the science community. So what roles did those whale wars really play? The answer is complex and contested and highly controversial. My view is that Bearing Witness certainly focused world attention on the whaling issue, and I think that was consequential. But the move to violence at sea was more complex and, in my view, counterproductive. While perhaps reinforcing the views of anti-whaling civil societies, it galvanised pro-whaling sentiment in Japan among a population and a community that were not particularly engaged in the whole whaling debate. It also forced anti-commercial whaling governments like Australia, the US, New Zealand, the Netherlands, and others to quite rightly stand beside Japan in condemning illegal activities that threatened human life at sea. So, if IWC parties claim that Japan was misusing Article 8 of the Convention, what did international law have to say? In 2010, Australia took Japan to the International Court of Justice in The Hague, in the Netherlands. We brought the case forward despite the senior counsel advice that we were unlikely to win. The court rarely gives definitive wins to one side or the other, and we were bringing a case on the purpose of science, a technical case, before a legal tribunal. It was our then Prime Minister Rudd who made the decision, notwithstanding the advice he had, to proceed with the case. The wonderful Mark Mangle from the University of California, Santa Cruz, was a star witness for Australia in this very intimidating, beautiful peace palace, the court of the ICJ. I too was a witness for Australia. In 2014, the ICJ found that Japan's whaling in Antarctica was illegal and it was not for the purposes of scientific research. Whatever your views of whaling are, this was an extraordinary precedent-setting success for science. Legal minds were able to hear highly technical scientific arguments and make a legal international law decision. In 2019, Japan withdrew from the ICRW, from the Whaling Convention. It ceased its high seas whaling in the Southern Ocean and the North Pacific and now conducts commercial whaling within its own EEZ. I cannot speak, of course, for the government of Japan's decision-making in deciding to withdraw from the convention, but I have no doubt that a loss in an international court of such profile had a major bearing on it. So, what of commercial whaling today? We know that it's an historic low and trending down. We know that Norway, as I mentioned earlier, under an objection to the moratorium, take about 400 to 600 minke whales each year. Iceland, under their reservation, take about 200 minke whales and 200 fin whales each year, and they are currently considering whether they will continue their commercial whaling program. Japan, now a non-IWC member, but still a strong and important observer state to the convention, take about 90 minke whales, 187 Brutus whales, 25 sei whales each year, and they intend to take a further 59 fin whales in coming years. Global demand for whale meat continues a steep decline, and trade in whale meat is highly constrained under CITES. Commercial whaling is also increasingly uneconomic. Nevertheless, and importantly, whaling does remain a legitimate and high key priority for some countries and parties to the ICRW. So, at almost 40 years old, how is the IWC holding up? And I'm going to use an example of a couple of papers that have been published this year and a few years ago to give one perspective on that. Many of you will have seen earlier this year a paper published in Nature by Peter Bridgewater and authors suggesting that we should dismantle zombie wildlife protection conventions once their work is done. They argue that the work of the IWC is done, therefore it's a zombie organisation, and it should fold because it has dealt with the issue largely of commercial whaling. So I am the chair of a zombie organisation by that measure. I'll add that to my CV. And in a sense of shameless self-promotion, I'm going to use my own paper as a counterpoint, which I'd published a few years earlier, where I claimed that at 75 years old, the IWC had never been more globally relevant. So the view expressed by Peter and authors is a view of direct interpretation of the words of the convention at the time they were written and placing that interpretation in the modern world. The question, of course, is can you interpret that original language in the modern context? The core of the ICRW's, the convention's intent was to rebuild whale stocks. In 1946, the view of all of the parties of the convention was that conservation was about rebuilding the whaling industry. Today, all parties remain committed to the conservation of whale stocks. A minority seek a future in which commercial whaling will be part of that future story, but almost all of the members also see that that conservation effort is about dealing with the many other non-whaling threats whales face. This slide perhaps shows that neatly in the threats to whales in 1946. Of course, climate change was really there, but we didn't know about it back then, but really it was whaling that was the single largest threat to whales at the time, and the plethora, which I won't go through, in the other slide that shows the enormous number of threatening processes that in this case the IWC is dealing with and many people here have spoken about at this conference. Another lens through which we can examine this issue is to look at how the views of the original designers and signatories of the ICRW have changed over time. 14 of the original 15 designers and signatories are still here today as members of the IWC. Canada withdrew in 1986 when the moratorium came in place. 3 countries conduct Aboriginal and subsistence whaling but have no ambitions for commercial whaling: Denmark, Russian Federation, USA. Only 1 original signatory still conducts commercial whaling, that's Norway. But at least 13 of the countries support some or all of the IWC's non-whaling related conservation agenda. So given the contested history in the IWC, what's it actually been able to achieve? Because many would portray it as dysfunctional and not able to have successes. The slide you're looking at now is from a meeting of the Scientific Committee a few years ago. It's important to highlight the importance and indeed uniqueness of the Scientific Committee of the IWC. Few, if any, other multilateral environmental agreements or regional fisheries management organisations have the quality and scale and scientific horsepower of the IWC. Each meeting, up to 200 scientists from all around the world assemble to work through a science agenda tailored to provide advice to the Commission. It is the Scientific Committee that has been central to much of the IWC's success. I'm going to focus very briefly on 2 of the successes in the realm of whaling: the revised management procedure, which sets catch limits for commercial whaling, and the Aboriginal subsistence whaling management procedure that sets strike limits for the hunters of the high Arctic in particular. So the revised management procedure replaced the new management procedure that was in place and failed prior to the moratorium. For the next 8 years, the Scientific Committee worked on a new process, a new system, the revised management procedure. It sets, really importantly, predetermined management objectives. For example, tuning levels, 0.072. That means that over a long period of time, a population of whales subject to whaling will be at or above 72% of its pre-whaling levels. So this is a key thing with the management, that it sets its management objectives. It uses limited but strategic and available data on abundance, removals from the population from whaling or any other human activities, and structure, genetic and spatial, and it self-corrects with regular abundance estimates. It simulates whaling using a wide range of plausible scenarios, including climate change, such as major shifts in carrying capacity, over a 100-year period. It is the earliest example of management strategy evaluation. It was before its time. The developers were brilliant. And it's a really important part of the success of the IWC. It was adopted in 1992, and it has had continued improvement since. It goes through 3 stages: the pre-assessment stage, where the data are examined, the population assessment stage, and the output stage. I won't go through this in detail, but I want to make the point that the management advice at the top, the actual catch limits or strike limits, whatever you're dealing with, is really important. But the process also delivers incredibly important outputs for conservation advice, for population status, and population trends. So it's not a single function process. Here's an example from the IWC, I think a fabulous example, of an enormous amount of work that is shown in a very simple format to give you a sense of relative abundance and trend of 3 separate populations: the grey whale, the common minke whale, and of course the vaquita. And at a very brief view of that, you can see the parlous and disastrous status of vaquita compared to the healthier, but not without challenge, positions of grey whales and common minke whales. The second management procedure, of course, was the Aboriginal Subsistence Whaling Management Procedure. It enables Aboriginal peoples to harvest whales in perpetuity at levels appropriate to their cultural and nutritional requirements, subject to other sustainability objectives. Here it is science and culture that drives the basis, formation and delivery of that procedure. It's tailored to each hunted population of whales, and strike limits are issued in 6-year blocks. It's a huge success for the IWC, the science in particular, but politics have caused major trust issues. Decadal abundance estimates of each hunted population give huge confidence about the status of the hunted populations. And here I show a slide showing the wonderful, the great, but very tragically the late Craig George, participating in a 2019 survey of bowhead whales at the northern tip of Alaska on the North Slope. I was privileged to participate in that survey with him, and we miss him dearly. But needs statements disempowered hunting communities, and politics eroded trust. Hunting communities needed to provide a needs statement that said the number of whales they needed and why, and these were then debated in the IWC, and the voting parties decided whether they would then issue and vote yes or no on the rights of those people to go hunting. It was a terrible power imbalance between the hunting communities and the voting parties. It was culturally difficult, is as soft a word as I can say. And often the issue of their hunting rights was held hostage to other issues in the IWC. You vote for us, we'll vote for you. Happily, though, this process has now moved, a new process has evolved, where if the hunting communities do not seek more whales, and the scientific committee say that it is still safe to take the number of whales they are requesting, then it can be agreed by consensus. So just recently in Lima, in Peru, that process was tested for the first time, and it was a huge success. It went through without a single voice of opposition. It was a major step in building trust back up between those hunting communities and the IWC. It provides international assurance of sustainability through the IWC processes that nowhere else can do. And it is an historic achievement shaped by science, culture, enormous amount of patient diplomacy that bodes very well for the IWC. I'll mention very briefly a couple of other elements of successes from the IWC. The Collaborative Research Consortium, the Southern Ocean Research Partnership that runs 7 major ongoing projects around the Southern Ocean involving 13 countries, and the IWC Power Cruises, the annual multinational research cruises that have operated in the North Pacific since 2010. These deliver tailored and important information to the IWC to assist in its decision making. They would not exist without the IWC's operations. The IWC also created the Conservation Committee in 2003. It was enormously controversial, and that's only 20 years ago. But over the past couple of decades, really, it has matured, it has adopted a strategic plan, and now is a major, largely uncontested part of the IWC agenda. Time counts. Some of the work that is done through the Scientific Committee and the Conservation Committee include, and I'm going to highlight just a couple, direct action on large whale entanglement. There's the wonderful David Matilla, many of you will know, who worked for the IWC and the Secretariat to really deliver a global whale entanglement response network. It brought together the national programs that have been so successful in their regions around the globe. Collectively, almost 1,800 trained participants have been worked through that system from 43 countries and 5 continents. Extraordinary. There are apprenticeships training the trainer that genuinely build capacity within the countries, a lot of developing countries participating in this program. It is funded primarily from voluntary funds from IWC members and NGO society. It could not happen in that global context without the IWC being that central point of work. It has a technical advisor, expert panel and steering group that work through the process. That model works extremely well and is now given, works through the Bycatch Initiative, Stranding Initiative and Ship Strike Initiative in the IWC. So we know a lot about bycatch, we've heard a lot about it here. It's a massive issue. The numbers are plain, I won't read them out. And the IWC's role has been to gather global expertise and provide that mitigation advice directly to governments. Scientific and conservation committees progress the work with the coordinator. It can't do this work in isolation, but it is one very major part of the jigsaw we need, including the SMM and all its work and all of the various people and societies and groups working on this issue. It is part of an essential solution. The IWC also produces the Whale Watching Handbook, particularly targeted at developing countries that wish to embark upon or improve their whale watching experience. It provides issues around responsible management, preparing for a trip, industry support, and species. Have a look at it online if you've not seen it. It's a fabulous resource. It's updated regularly. A huge amount of work went into doing it, and it's widely used. Up until recently, the IWC really only had whaling-related tools in its sort of management toolkit. But over the past 2 decades, it's developed conservation tools, and conservation management plans in particular have been a huge success. They are transnational management plans for large and small cetaceans. The species are listed below for which they apply, and the square bracketed ones at the end are in transit at the moment. The point here I want to make is that those are evolving and improving in effectiveness. They can be enhanced with collaborative arrangements with other groups. But equally importantly, they include small cetaceans. 15 years ago, if anyone had mentioned a management issue relating to small cetaceans, flags will have gone up and statements would have been made that the IWC has no competence to deal with small cetaceans. These conservation management plans now go through uncontested. Time and diplomacy and work are effective. Other initiatives in the IWC are shown in the slide. I don't have time to go through them. He looked nervously at his 10-minute clock. None of these would have been effective or even possible without the IWC's international, political and legal status as the globally leading convention responsible for the management and conservation of whales. Other treaties and conventions, including, for example, the Antarctic Treaty System and the newly established High Seas Treaty, cede responsibility for whales management and conservation to the IWC. So it's in a very unique and powerful position. So, what are the current and emerging challenges in the IWC? I've touched on the issues around interpretation of the convention and the words on that, so I don't want to dwell on it too much. At the heart of that interpretation is the question of whether there'll be a revival of commercial whaling. In the end, it should not matter. My view is that for all the reasons I've outlined, it's actually unlikely politically, economically, to resurge in a major way. But if it did, the IWC has in place the revised management procedure, and that is a powerful and important tool that should give us some confidence. The final question about whether there's a real dichotomy, as is argued by many, between whaling and conservation is that I really hope, so far, I've argued persuasively that because we live in a complex and unpredictable world, the ICRW, the Whaling Convention, is entirely fit for purpose to lead international management and conservation of whales in all its forms. Issues around will future needs for marine protein include whale meat? Global food security, the rights of coastal communities and whaling are increasingly being debated and conflated in the IWC. Each meeting, resolutions come forward that make the link between commercial whaling and food security. We currently know that less than 20% of food protein is derived from marine sources, and of course whale meat would be a tiny, if even measurable, portion of that. The debate requires advances in ecosystem science and development in fishery technology to argue persuasively, but even at our current levels of understanding, it seems highly unlikely that slow-growing whales with low reproduction rate and which are subject to increasingly complex and compounding threats are likely to play much, if any, role in sustainable, long-term solutions to global food security. Most importantly, we need to focus on fisheries management and politics, as this will be the greatest potential to deliver improved ocean productivity, marine health, and global food security. A key part is the issue around giving regulatory teeth and influence to conservation management. It's a big task. I'm repeating myself here because repetition gets noticed. The IWC has the international legal and political status to drive global conservation action. Expanding, cumulative and emerging threats require a coordinated and effective international response. Small cetaceans, as we all know, are disproportionately affected. The IWC needs to cooperate with other multilateral environment agreements and other organizations, and that's essential. But perhaps the most important part on this slide is slowly and inexorably we need to move from advice to regulation. That's a huge challenge. It'll be resisted, but time, as I say, and changing attitudes are part of delivering that kind of eventual shift. Governance and decision-making remain issues in the IWC. Since the moratorium, the IWC membership has grown from 39 to 88 parties. Many no longer even participate in the meeting, but remain members. So issues of quorum, dry administrative decision-making issues of quorum, now are used as a negotiation tool, have been by both sides of the debate for many years. So a large group of people, parties, can walk out and therefore break quorum and completely stop any decision-making being made by the organisation. Governance, decision-making and financial security are pressing issues in the IWC as they are in many agencies. Financial issues, I know, are a pressing issue for the society, so it's no orphan in that. What of a future state for the IWC? And I apologise for the extraordinary, what appears to be a hybrid between a whale and a shark that I use in the slide there. That should give you geneticists something interesting to work on. But a future state requires developing a less polarised, more collective vision for the IWC, and that's central to an effective future. And while that's a big ambition, I have to say that in Lima, we're part way along that journey, and it's a matter of continuing the journey, not excluding the rights of every party to bring up whatever they wish and whatever ends they wish to deliver through the IWC, but that is moving that way. Whaling and conservation must remain parts of the IWC's business, with decision-making according to the IWC governance rules. Science is fundamental to change, but it will always share influence with culture, as it always should, and politics, as sometimes we wish it wouldn't. Evolution and change are almost always slow and achieved through consistent and patient diplomacy. Compromise and pragmatism are key ingredients. Voltaire, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. It's a part of that negotiation. For here, the society has a major role to play. It's an unexploited role, I think, in my view. The SMM, I believe, is the global brains trust for marine mammal science. It's really important. These meetings are extraordinary. I'm so thrilled to be back here. It's been a few years since I've been to one of your wonderful meetings. The International Whaling Commission's Scientific Committee and Conservation Committee are a subset of scientists and managers who specialise in providing advice and conservation advice to the Commission. Many of the people are here today. 3 past chairmen of the Scientific Committee are here, and the current chairman, Lindsay Porter, is also here. There's a lot of overlap. Current interaction between the SMM and IWC is, however, ad hoc, and we do many things in parallel. I'm very aware of the IWC's work on the bycatch initiative. I'm also very aware about what a pressing and growing issue it is within SMM. My plea to the leadership of this society, and from my role now as chair of the IWC, is that we should be formalising links on these pressing questions. They can be issues around bycatch mitigation, role of cetaceans in ecosystems, quantifying cumulative impacts to different threatening processes, or many other things. I think it's a huge opportunity, and I would hope that it could take some formal status, such as an MOU. And I look forward to working with Lindsay in her role as chair of the scientific committee of the IWC and the SMM leadership team in seeing what we can achieve over the next year or two. So, the IWC is the global authority on the management and conservation of whales. Threats to global cetaceans have never been as pressing and require coordinated government, science-based response. They don't require that alone. They require the work you do. They require an enormous range of pressure from civil society. But that statement stands. There has to be coordinated government, science-based response as part of the solutions. Disputes on commercial whaling remain. They're legitimate, but they are now just one important part of the IWC's business. They no longer define the IWC. The IWC, to quote my paper, has never been more globally relevant. And the provocative title I put up at the start of my tide, Are the Whale Wars Really Over? Well, I'm going to leave that to you to decide. And I'm going to close with a final slide to let you know that IWC 70 will occur in October 2026 in this fine country. Second time ever in Australia, it will return to this country, and I hope many of you will be able to participate and certainly watch and see what happens there. And with that, I once again thank the organisers, and I thank you all for your attention.
Thanks very much, Nick. We have time for questions. You know whether, yep, over on the right side.
So, Nick, you were supposed to mention the booth.
And can I take this opportunity to thank Ellen so much for the hard work she's done on the booth, and please visit her there. And you're quite right. Naomi, sorry, I thought of course it's Naomi. Yes, I've taken my glasses off. Sorry, Naomi. And one of the great things there that Naomi will share with you, and she's cross with me because I've not spent time at the booth, is that there's a wonderful book that is a beautiful summary of translating the complex and technical work of the scientific committee to completely non-science literate commissioners. It's really lovely. It's been a huge amount of work, and it's a really important part of how we actually affect change by government decision makers. Thanks, Naomi, for the reminder.
Yeah, I guess I'll go ahead. The light's on me. Nick, it's Doug, just in case you can't see. I know you can't see with your glasses on or off.
The light's always on you, Doug.
The light's always on. Fabulous, Nick. Thanks it was a really compelling walk through the IWC and its relevance today. The question is, in a world of areas beyond national jurisdiction and moving from recommendations to regulations, how does that to happen? I mean, nobody has statutory authority on the high seas. We'd love to have something like the International Seabed Authority and under UNCLOS, which of course the US hasn't signed. But what are some options for regulatory authority? Thanks.
Yeah, no, thanks for the question, Doug. And it's a big issue. And so the new High Seas Treaty, which is the biological diversity beyond national jurisdictions, is attempting to deal exactly with that. And as I mentioned, it cedes a lot of authority to the International Whaling Commission. That's a really crucially important step. So it is actually giving authority to the IWC to be the organisation that manages whales in that area. As I mentioned at the start, and I want to reiterate, they're part of the global commons. And so every country, whether it's has a marine border or whatever, they're part of the global commons. Every voice counts. And so it's a slow journey, Doug. I think things like in the IWC, the conservation management plans that involve multi-parties, range states that share boundaries of particular species, having that move to actual regulation across those and the harmonising of regulations across country is going to be one of the really first important steps. It's a long road. It'll take time, but I think it is, we are moving in that direction. In my time at the IWC, I've seen shifts that way. It's frustrating because it needs to happen much more quickly than it is, but I think it's through pressure on governments to ensure that those happen. Thanks, Doug.
Should we go to the spotlight and then come back to Simon after that?
Okay, thank you. Icha from JCU. Considering the importance of cultural and human dimension in conservation, is IWC still engaging with Japan to discuss their domestic harvest level using cultural approaches? And if not, do you know if any other organizations are doing so with a culturally sensitive approach? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. It's a really important one, and I think the IWC have learned some really important lessons in being much more culturally sensitive, moving away from, frankly, sort of cultural imperialism in the way it dealt with some of these things. So it's the start of a good journey. Japan is not a member of the IWC, but it attends and participates extensively as an observer state. So the IWC isn't directly engaged in that issue in Japan. I'm not offhand aware of other than civil society organisations, which official international organisations deal directly with that issue. But there are conversations, as Japan and its many wonderful scientists and participants in the meetings attend both the scientific committee and the main commission meeting, those conversations do nevertheless occur. So yes, it's not I don't know of any direct country any direct organisation engaging on that issue.
I think we'll just stay with the spotlight for now. Go ahead.
So, do you have an idea how can we help the whales more?
What a beautiful question. I don't have the answer, but I think I know the way. And I think the way is that it takes all of us to be doing what we can in the simple things we do as individuals, in the organisations to which we belong, such as here, the Society of Marine Mammalogy, to the arrangements that we represent countries in, the International Whaling Commission, the IUCN Cetacean Specialist Group, the migratory species groups. It takes everyone. No one can do it on their own, and it takes time and patience, and those groups working more effectively together. If I had one thing to say as an important message, it's going to be that all of the organisations and individuals wanting to deliver what you want, better protection, looking after our marine mammals better, they need to work better together. Not repeat what they're doing, not work in isolation, all work together. And with time and patience, I have to remain optimistic that things will improve. And thanks for a beautiful question.
Over to you, Simon.
Great talk, Nick. I guess I'm just struck about all the other marine mammal species that are subject to such similar threats and impacts. Many species commercially harvested, many species subject to sustainable First Nations harvests. All the amazing firepower and capability in the IWC. Do you, and I guess the evolving nature that you described so eloquently, do you foresee a time when the IWC broadens its oversight and its impact to include other marine mammal species?
No. I think there are really encouraging and positive steps around engaging on small cetaceans. And I think that's really important. We need to work more closely with NAMCO, for example, in the North Atlantic. So small cetaceans, I hope. But Sophie also talked to me earlier in the meeting around, where is an IWC equivalent for pinnipeds? Where is an IWC equivalent for other marine mammal species? And I don't see the IWC moving in that area. One of the challenges, and it goes to that issue around the interpretation of the convention, is that to revisit the convention and rewrite it requires a meeting of the parties, virtually consensus agreement around everything. That's just not possible. To change language in the IWC, you would never reach an agreement now. So the successes are around very careful and diplomatic moves within a modern interpretation of the old language. That will constrain the IWC to cetaceans. I hear you, as a pinniped biologist, I hear you on issues around other marine mammals, and I don't know straight off what the international arrangements are. There is the Convention for Migratory Species and other issues that provide some of that work, but it's a difficult question.
There are enormous gaps and holes through all that in species that are not picked up, so...
There surely are, Simon.
That's what we're all here for.
Yes, indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we've got time for one more question. Go ahead.
Thank you very much for your talk. I was wondering about the other states that are still doing commercial whaling, so Norway and Iceland. How are these stocks and numbers managed, and is that something that the IWC has their eyes on?
Certainly the IWC, as I mentioned, continues to work on the revised management procedure, and Norway use a version of the RMP. They use a lower tuning level. If you remember, I talked about 72%. They correct me, Norwegians among the audience, I think it's 66% that's used. So they use a variation on that. They're participants in the IWC, as is Iceland. And so there is a lot of interaction with both of them. They both whale legally under international law through the convention. My view is that those governments will make their decisions. As I mentioned, Icelandic government is currently deciding whether or not to reissue licenses for whaling in Iceland. I don't know where they will land on that. I believe the Norwegian government will, from all my discussions, will defend their whaling, but will not prop it up and will allow the demand for whale meat and the interest of their nationals to participate in it to dictate, its long-term future. But if you go back to that original graph, it is a slow decline in whaling. The demand for whale meat among populations decreases all the time. So the pressures to push commercial whaling back up are not there. It really is uneconomic now. Usually has to be propped up with subsidies and support. And trade is amazingly difficult. So it's within the sovereign rights of those countries to decide what they wish to do. They do participate, and it's really important in the IWC processes, and I think that's part of it. But thanks, it's a great question.
Thank you.
Okay, just one more question. Cheers.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you for your great talk. I want to ask, where do this meat from commercial whale goes? I understand that most of them is going to feed animals like chicken or fish. I don't know if, because the people don't consume. So when I ask people in Japan or Iceland or so, it is not so much consumed. So, thank you.
Thanks for the question. I'm not an authority on this, but I certainly, whale meat is eaten in Iceland, in Norway, and in Japan. It's not eaten enormously widely. You can visit restaurants in most of those countries and find whale meat. Large amounts of whale meat are stockpiled in warehouses because there is not a strong demand. I'm not aware that whale meat is used for animal feed, but I am not an expert on that topic. But primarily, it's aimed at human consumption, and certainly the government of Japan have been trying to encourage their nationals to revisit the consumption of whale meat, but it seems there's not a huge appetite to do so. Thanks for the question.
Please join me in thanking Nick again.
Thank you.
Barb Taylor was awarded the Society for Conservation Biology Award for her outstanding career achievement in translating conservation science into real-world conservation efforts, and the American Cetacean Society's Lifetime Achievement Award. There are other accolades, but frankly, listing them would take us over time. Barb is today representing Cetacean Specialist Group of the IUCN, and the title of her plenary is Changing Human Behaviour. Cases from around the globe reveal the need to expand conservation expertise. Barb Taylor.
Good day, everyone. That's the end of my Australian. My Siri on my phone, I put it in an Australian accent so I could learn to speak Australian, but that's it. So I want to thank, of course, the organizers of this wonderful meeting for allowing me the opportunity to speak to you about changing human behavior. And I also want to thank all of you for, it's been such a wonderful opportunity to hear about so many disciplines. And as I've come to these meetings through the years, I see more and more diversity, both in sex, age, and color. So I'm really, really happy to be here at this meeting, and I hope everyone has enjoyed it as much as I have. So my mother turned 100 last week, and as a 100-year-old, she asks me, she asks me pretty much every day, so what are you talking about in Australia? And I say, well, changing human behavior. And her surprised response is always, but you don't know anything about that. And in a weird sort of way, that is actually the point of my talk. And after the recent US elections, I feel I can say unequivocally that I do not understand human behavior. I would much rather be up here talking about whale song or dolphin sex, but unfortunately you're going to hear me talk about human behavior. So 11 years ago, I had the opportunity, again in the Southern Hemisphere, to give a plenary talk. And I'm going to, for those of you who don't remember my every word, touch a little bit on what I said 13 years ago. In that case, I did a little bit of a review of history about what ingredients had worked and what ingredients we needed to add to the recipe for conservation for marine mammals. And in the 1970s to the 1990s, there were some real conservation successes. And in fact, you heard about some of those just a moment ago, the curtailment of both commercial whaling, but also high seas drift net fisheries, and the killing of dolphins in the tuna fleets. And this was accomplished through a series of people that came together to make that happen. NGOs, the natural resource users, the implementers, including enforcement, the legislators, natural scientists, and in some cases, the courts. But I suggested at that point that we hadn't dealt well with some of the biggest threats: bycatch, unsustainable degradation of our coastal resources and riverine resources, and climate change. And what did we need to do to change our recipe? And I suggested adding new ingredients: educators, media specialists, economists, and fisheries technicians that could help with gear modifications. Well, nearly all human behavior, or nearly all conservation, is about managing human behavior. So I wanted to take a step back and say, how have we done in conservation? So let's reflect on how we have done with just looking at cetaceans. And I want to emphasize, even though I'll be cetacean-centric, I think a lot of this applies to all of the marine mammal species. So we recently published a paper on the red list status of the world's whales, dolphins, and porpoises. And we looked at the proportion of species that are listed as threatened. That's critically endangered, or vulnerable on the IUCN red list. And you can see that this proportion increased from 15% in 1991 to 19% in 2008 to 26% in 2021. If we take a closer look at this, we can see that there's striking differences between the four habitat categories that we looked at: river, coastal, shelf, and open ocean. The riverine species are all either endangered or critically endangered, and over half of the species found in coastal waters are threatened with extinction. Basically, if you belong to a species that lives in close proximity to humans, the challenges to your survival are considerable. In my 2013 talk, I did add economists to the ingredients list, but I left out all other social scientists. And this omission is clearly pointed out in a very recent paper called Changing Human Behavior to Conserve Biodiversity. This paper opens with, conservation of biodiversity is above all else an exercise in human persuasion. Across the more than 40,000 species currently listed as globally threatened, 98% are threatened exclusively by processes driven by human behavior. Yet conservation remains predominantly a natural science discipline, with the social and behavioral sciences playing a secondary role. In response to the need to broaden our perspective to provide more effective conservation for cetaceans, we formed a group within the cetacean specialist group called the Integrated Conservation Planning for Cetaceans Group. That group concentrated on filling critical information and knowledge gaps to be able to develop more effective conservation plans. But it also became very closely allied with the Conservation Planning Specialist Group, which is within the IUCN. And they have experience with hundreds of species and have a mission to contribute to taking lessons learned to create really effective conservation plans. They've embraced what is called the one plan approach that begins by identifying stakeholders and involving them throughout the planning process. And I might point out that they did a big review of how effective conservation plans had been. And what they found was that there were a lot of conservation plans that were gathering dust on the shelves. So they reflected on this and decided that what really needed to happen was to change the process right from the beginning. And they emphasized that you needed to invite stakeholders to the table to actually participate in the planning process. And by participating, the stakeholders have buy-in to seeing that the plan actually is working for the species. IUCN defines a stakeholder as any individual or group that may affect or be affected by conservation work. IUCN offers training courses in how to facilitate conservation planning. And clearly, identifying these stakeholders is a really important step that those of us that are trained in the natural scientists are not well equipped to do. Getting the right people to the table is something that many conservation social scientists are trained to do. Late in 2022, there was a workshop that was held on the human dimensions of small cetacean conservation. And this workshop concluded that, 1, incorporating human dimension considerations into small cetacean conservation efforts means careful attention to the role of human behavior in causing and mitigating impacts on animals and their environment. 2, successful strategies for improving dolphin and porpoise conservation must ultimately include actions that result in changes in human behavior. And 3, we must work with and for people to identify shared goals for conserving dolphin and porpoise species while ensuring that human communities prosper. The participants in that workshop came from the following disciplines: cetacean field biology, conservation biology, social and psychology, human-wildlife conflict and coexistence, community engagement and communications, conservation planning, and economics and ecosystem services. As a participant in that workshop and a conservation biologist for over 40 years, this was the first time I had ever heard of a conservation psychologist, much less met one. I didn't even know that was a job. There were kinds of experts, these were the kinds of experts that we needed to bring to the table early to help us identify the right stakeholders. Even though many action plans have already been created or are in draft, these experts can still be brought in because we need to motivate human behavioral change. Let me give some brief definitions that I found for some of these conservation social science fields that we examined in the species cases to follow that may be less familiar to you. Conservation economics is the use of economics to understand the costs and benefits of sustaining natural ecosystems. Its purpose is to accomplish more widespread and lasting conservation by lowering its costs, revealing its benefits, and fitting it within genuine economic development. Conservation sociology is a field that uses sociological theory and research methods to study the relationship between humans and nature and to improve conservation practices and policies. Conservation psychology is the study of how humans interact with nature and how to encourage people to protect the environment. It's an interdisciplinary field that uses the principles of psychology to understand and solve environmental issues. Community engagement is a bit trickier to explain. One of the definitions that I found is community engagement is a collaborative process that involves working with groups of people to address issues that affect their well-being. The goal is to achieve sustainable outcomes that improve the community and its members. I also found this graphic that says community engagement is a bridge between expertise and knowledge of institutions and communities and describes it as a bi-directional field. But in the Human Dimensions workshop, the social scientists emphasized the need to identify community members that were trusted by the community and would be a reliable and consistent communicator between the various experts, the stakeholders, and the communities. So while community engagement is a process, it also requires a person or persons with very specific skills to be the trusted translator between all the parties involved. It is not only a challenge identifying these community conservation leaders, but also of finding ways to fund them so that they can play this important role for long enough to affect change in human behavior. To get a better idea of where we are with incorporating the human dimension, I'm looking at these following case studies: Yangtze finless porpoises, Atlantic humpback dolphins, Lahill's bottlenose dolphins, vaquita porpoises, and North Atlantic right whales. I want to make clear that I asked my co-authors to provide these case study overviews without the opportunity to talk in depth with them about what each types of expertise actually entails. But what I'm trying to do here is make some preliminary points that I hope will inspire you to start involving social scientists in your conservation work. For each species, there's an overview of status and stakeholders, and in the interest of time, I'll only mention the top stakeholder that they listed. Yangtze finless porpoises are listed as critically endangered and have about 1,200 individuals. The major threats are shipping, habitat degradation, extreme weather events that may freeze or desiccate porpoise habitat, and illegal fisheries. They occur in a single country, China, and the first listed stakeholder is government. Yangtze finless porpoises are the only clear success story that I'll be talking about today. The decline in their natural habitat has been halted due to the government both banning fishing and doing a major cleanup of their habitat. Between 2017 and 2022, Yangtze finless porpoises went from about 1,000 animals to about 1,200 animals, which for a porpoise is really remarkable. The insurance populations that are in oxbow lakes are increasing to the point that the animals are now being released back into their natural river and lake habitat. Today, we examine 5 types of social science expertise: economics, sociology, education and communication, psychology, and community engagement. I asked my co-authors to rate the level of current engagement from low to high. For Yangtze Finlay's purposes, the level of engagement of expertise is mixed: low for psychology, medium for economics and sociology, and high for education and communication and community engagement. I then asked co-authors to rate each type of expertise as to whether it had a low, medium, or high need to reduce the threats to the species. In the case of Yangtze Finlay's porpoises, the type of expertise with the highest need, economics and sociology, did not match the levels with the highest level of engagement. Actions that have reduced threats have been taken by the greatest stakeholder, which is the government. With the ability of the government to make changes like banning fishing in the Yangtze River, community engagement, which is high, is not actually required to reduce the threat. Atlantic humpback dolphins are red-listed as critically endangered, and there are about 3,000 individuals. Major threats are bycatch, coastal development, and climate change. They are present in at least 14 countries, and the first listed stakeholder is fishers. The number of countries, and hence governments, economies, and cultures, is highest for this species. This creates special challenges for the human dimension aspects. Really impressive progress has been made by the Consortium for the Conservation of Atlantic Humpback Dolphin, and they have a very nice booth downstairs if you haven't had a chance to visit it yet. But even so, the levels of engagement were rated as medium to low. And in large part, this is not because they aren't working very hard, but because they have so many countries and so many cultures to deal with. Nearly every type of expertise is listed as critical to reduce the threat of bycatch. This case highlights that species that span many human cultures will require even longer time periods to effect sufficient behavioral change to save species. Lahille's bottlenose dolphins are red-listed as vulnerable, and there are about 600 individuals. The threat is bycatch, and they are present in 3 countries. The first listed stakeholder, again, is fishers. The level of engagement is low to medium across these types of expertise, but again, this is a lot of a range problem. It's high in some areas and lower in others. Both sociology and community engagement are considered high needs to reduce the threat of bycatch. Vaquitas are red-listed as critically endangered, and there are only about 10 individuals remaining. The major threat is bycatch. They are present in a single country, Mexico, and the first listed stakeholder, again, is fishers. Levels of engagement of expertise are low to medium, whereas sociology, psychology, and community engagement are deemed as high needs to reduce bycatch. And finally, North Atlantic right whales are red-listed as critically endangered, and there are about 350 individuals. The major threats are ship strikes and entanglement in about equal proportion for threats, and therefore there are 2 different stakeholders, both the fishers and the shipping industry, and they're present in mainly in 2 countries. Levels of engagement of expertise were medium to high for all social science categories, and these met well with the need to reduce the threats. So now if we look over all of those case studies, and we just focus on those that were deemed to be in high need to reduce the threats over these case studies, we see that each case had very different needs for social scientists and different levels of current engagement. Every case has at least one category of social science expertise identified as in high need to reduce threats. I've used the hand with a plant to denote cases where the engagement level is medium but needs to grow to high. The category with the most sad faces that is with high need but low current engagement, is community engagement. We need to recognize that for almost every case, community engagement is critical to successfully changing human behavior and thereby reducing threats. As a community of conservation scientists, we need to effectively communicate this need to fund community engagement leaders to other stakeholders and especially to funders. Another interesting case here is all the happy faces for North Atlantic right whales that just went from being red listed as endangered to being critically endangered in 2020. And perhaps the continued plight of the species is not attributable to lack of expertise in the social sciences. However, dealing with the threats effectively will likely take a considerable time. Many people expect instant gratification from making what seems to them a costly behavioral change. For example, fishers who change to ropeless gear or shippers who slow their speed may feel their behavioral change is ineffective if whale populations don't increase immediately. Work to get those critical stakeholders to have realistic expectations might benefit from the skills of a conservation psychologist or sociologist. The paper Changing Human Behavior to Conserve Biodiversity had a very important cautionary note. The need to influence people has been a significant aspect of conservation work for several decades. However, the focus has often been on raising awareness, improving knowledge, and changing attitudes. Although these factors may be important in certain contexts, a significant body of work suggests that changes to awareness, knowledge, or attitudes seldom leads to change in behavior. Indeed, although influencing these attributes may be necessary, these changes are only initial steps in bringing about behavioral change. True conservation gains and the mitigation of extinction rates can be realized only when change occurs tangibly in the real world. Therefore, emphasizing awareness, knowledge, attitudes, or other intangible indicators to understand or change behavior can be a distraction. These indicators are easier to influence, but frequently are not directly related to behavioral change itself. As a result, they may create an illusion of progress. So for each of our case studies, I asked the co-authors what measures were used to gauge changes in human behavior that would lead to reduction of the threats to each species or subspecies. I grouped their responses into indirect measures that looked at the status of the affected species and direct measures of changes in actual human behavior. I also used color code to capture whether the measure was actually being taken, and these are just my opinions. But again, this is just to sort of provoke your thought processes. Abundance or trends in abundance were the most commonly used metrics, and I will say that they are very much indirect metrics of changes in human behavior. And note that vaquitas are not listed there because numbers are now so small and precision is so poor in estimating those numbers that they cannot be used as measures to gauge changes in human behavior. I colored the metrics for both the dolphin species in yellow, both because they are very early in the process of trying to change human behavior, and also because only part of the range is currently being measured. Yangtze finless porpoise and North Atlantic right whales have green checks, but sadly, vaquitas have 2 red checks in the direct measures of the amount of gill net and the uptake of alternative gear. Currently, neither are being measured, although there has been some good measurement in the past, and I think they would be very influential things to report to the international community, but it has not been consistently done. I want to leave you with some lessons learned from vaquitas, with an update on this creature that is so near and dear to my heart. You can see I'm wearing my full vaquita uniform. So we have known for decades that saving this species ultimately involved fishing communities switching to gears that didn't kill vaquitas and still allowed them to make a decent living. When I was being trained to facilitate conservation planning by the IUCN, I asked them, when you come to figuring out what stakeholders should come to the table, how do you deal with agencies that would lie about their interests in making changes, namely the Mexican fisheries, and with stakeholders that are clearly powerful but would not even come to the table, namely cartels selling illegal totuaba swim bladders? And the trainers were sadly not able to address my questions, but I will come back to that later. Miraculously, since 2018, about 10 vaquitas have been hanging on, mainly in the area you see here called the zero tolerance area. The Mexican Navy seeded this area with hundreds of concrete blocks with metal hooks designed to ensnare gillnets. The Sea Shepherd Conservation Society recorded a reduction of fishing of over 90%, and in 2 years has removed 9 ghost nets, with only 5 of those entangled on the hooks. Last May, we saw only 6 to 8 vaquitas in that protected area. The last sighting included an individual that was seen in 2018 and 2019, but not in 2021, 22, or 23, but then we saw this individual again in 2024. And we needed to know whether vaquitas were someplace else. So recent acoustic research, which you see, I guess, on the left for you, still shows that most of the vaquitas are within the ZTA. So the dots that you see there are where there are passive acoustic detectors, and the colored dots are places where vaquitas were detected. And you can see that there are colored dots that are outside in what used to be their normal range before the population collapsed. And of course, finding more vaquitas is always great news, and it gives us more hope for the species. However, those vaquitas that are venturing outside the ZTA, which is truly a sanctuary for them, are completely unprotected from gill netting. Almost no progress has been made in converting fishers to using vaquita-safe gear. Most fishers do not trust the government, and their opinions and insights have been consistently undervalued in conservation discussions. There is still a strong need to use social scientists to try something different to make progress, and there are some local community members supportive of alternative gear who could be trained into the role of leading community engagement. I wish I could go back in time and try using the one-plan approach in the early days of vaquita work in the 1990s. I now think that this critical step of choosing stakeholders to be like choosing a jury for the fate of vaquita. I would love to have a conservation psychologist sitting by my side who could whisper in my ear, "Fisheries manager number 2 is lying through his teeth," or "Fisherman number 4 really cares about the habitat." For vaquita, we know quite a bit about what doesn't work, but I'm certain there are more important lessons that we don't yet know about. It would be very enlightening to have social scientists interview now retired fisheries managers to learn at what point we should have stopped wasting our time on expecting their help so that we could have moved on to seek alternate ways that we might be able to save vaquitas. Oh, you get to see the little vaquitas swimming around. There was once a time when I believed that conservation biologists could save species on our own without involving other disciplines. So naive. Conservation involves changing human behavior and doing what almost certainly requires bringing in social science expertise and working very closely with stakeholders. My mother was exactly right that I don't know much about changing human behavior, but now I do know that there are people who do. We need to bring their expertise to the table. But our role as conservation biologists is still very important. We need to provide the best possible science in a timely fashion. We need to maintain and convey to others our passion about our species and project the belief that the threats can be managed to allow threatened populations to recover to healthy levels. If we say there is no hope, why should people change their behavior? And we need to recognize the critical importance of working with other experts and stakeholders. And to avoid simply having the illusion of progress, we need to employ and advocate for metrics that determine whether actions are or are not working. I may not be standing up here pontificating in another decade, but I hope I can sit in the audience and listen to success stories of integrated conservation planning for marine mammals that led to recovery of threatened populations. I hope that I can hear more social science talks about changing human behavior that led to humans beginning to live sustainably on our planet. Thank you for listening, and please feel free to reach out to the IUCN specialist groups to find the expertise and training to make conservation more effective.
Thank you very much, Barb. If you have questions, you know where the speakers are. We have time.
Hello. Hi, Barb. How are you doing? Great presentation. Thank you for highlighting the need for social science and conservation psychology in this field. And just taking a little leaf out of Nick's book, if anyone wants to know more, I have a short talk on that subject today. Quick question for you. One of the big problems in getting social scientists and conservation psychologists and conservation marketers and everyone into this work is our own little bias that social science is fuzzy and not real. How do you think we can all help ourselves change and overcome that?
Yeah, I was pretty late in realizing that. Not that I thought it was a fuzzy science, but just not really for some inexplicable reason, not understanding that the key to conservation was changing human behavior. And I think it really would be good if we could somehow find a way for people to be able to tap into that expertise and really study more about those fields. And that perhaps that's something that the society can do or a future workshop can do to help us, make some gains there.
Thank you.
Hi, Barb, thanks for your great talk, and I knew we'd move you over to the dark side.
Okay.
I'm really happy that someone with your scientific dedication and curiosity is taking on these issues. If I can make a couple of points for your thoughts and opinion. One, I remember in the 80s, and yes, I remember in the 80s, when Michael Soule began his idealistic journey into conservation biology, that the science was supposed to be integrated in that way. And I feel like the society of conservation biology went away from that and then is coming back into that now. The other is the idea, and as a geographer, this is something I've been looking at for many decades, of the journey from multidisciplinary to interdisciplinary to transdisciplinary research. And what I would urge is that, especially in education and people who are students and postdocs, to work in that journey and to look at actually learning the language and disciplines as much as they can while maintaining their specializations. And the third is that the people who have been my teachers are the scientists in so many countries around the world who cannot help but be involved in more than biology, that have to work with governments and economies and fisheries and communities, and otherwise cannot exist and do their science and conservation. So again, those have been my teachers. Thank you for your talk.
Thank you.
Hi, Barb. I'm Carla Litchfield, the head of psychology at the University of South Australia. Thank you for your talk. I also started in both biology and psychology and worked with chimpanzees as the first psychologist in the field in Uganda in the 1990s. And I also discovered that changing human behaviour at that time was the way to go. So I just wanted to say thank you, and Andrew, who asked a question earlier, and I gave a whole workshop on changing human behaviour. So if anyone's interested in contacting us, just see the talks that were then. And I'd love to co-author a paper with you, because I think that is possibly one way of reaching more people as well. So thank you.
Excellent.
Thank you. Thank you, Barb. Very great talk. Thank you. So in most places, particularly in developing countries, community buy-ins or cooperation is definitely important to conservation success, and I agree with that. So my understanding with the Yangtze finless porpoise is that it is largely due to the government enforcement instead of the community buy-ins. Hence, a stick approach instead of the carrot approach. So because the level of engagement is low, I wonder if this is going to be a true success in the long run, and whether there is a way to introduce the carrots or incentives to the locals in addition to or instead of the stick in the Yangtze porpoise case. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I had the pleasure, well, I had the sad honor, I guess, of being on the 2006 cruise where we failed to find any baiji. And then coming back in 2019 for a workshop on Yangtze finless porpoise. And I was thrilled to see how much community engagement there was. I mean, there were like 40 different NGOs that deal with Yangtze finless porpoise. So they actually have very high community engagement. And I think the jury's out on just how well the stick it's working now, but it's a temporary ban. So I think you do need community engagement to give support to continue that ban. So I think you should talk to my Chinese colleagues. They would know much better than I, but I do think it's always important to have support to keep things in the long run. Thank you.
We have time for 2 more questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your lovely and very timely talk. I've been reflecting on, I've been doing some introspection since my travel from the US to this conference, and I hope you don't mind if I just share some reflections, but then a question at the end. This conference, the end of this conference for me and probably many others symbolizes more than just saying goodbye to friends and colleagues and this beautiful place, but it heralds a return to a state of disparity and uncertainty and fear. And what the election results in the US have made clear to me, probably many others, is that the cost of living and the economy are more important to Americans than conservation and climate change. And I think all these things, we all realize these are all intertwined, but if people won't be able to change their behaviors if they feel unsafe or their human rights are being violated. So I've been wondering, in the purpose of our research, like what our role as individuals and maybe even as a society is to stand in solidarity with some of the social and human issues that are plaguing our societies around the world, but not just within our marine mammal and science space, but like partnering with organizations in our communities and countries. Just thank you.
Yeah, well, those are Certainly, I think sentiments that a lot of people around the world are feeling. I mean, there is a swing of the pendulum to the right, right when those of us who are natural scientists know we're in the midst of a massive crash in biodiversity and severe crisis with climate change, that if we don't do something now, it's going to be affecting many, many generations to come. And so I guess the only thing I can say is that we have to be persistent and consistent in putting out our message to people, and you know, just try to garner the support in hopes that this pendulum will swing back and we can take actions in time to save both the climate and the species. Thank you.
Doug?
Thanks for a wonderful talk, Barb. And I would just like to point out that it's just over half of the people in the U.S. Feel that way. The rest, the 49.9% of us don't. So I did what, Barb, thank you very much for putting all this in context. And you know, being at the institution where I am, we are steeped in social science all the time and have been for many years. And it's really good to see it coming so much more to the fore. And I have a suggestion on that front, and I think you might know somebody who might be able to help you, Nick Gales. You know, the title, the name of the journal, the IWC journal, as we all know, is the Journal of Cetacean Research and Management. And I've thought for a long time that it should be changed to the Journal of Cetacean Research and the Management of People.
Excellent point.
Thank you, Barb.
Yeah, it is all about the management of people, and yeah.
Go ahead, promptly.
I'm a contractor affiliate with the Northeast Fisheries Science Center, and there's a group of people there called the Social Science Branch, and I assume other places around know it too. And do you think that the expertise of these sorts of people can be leveraged within the constraints of government, being government employees, for the sorts of goals you describe?
Oh boy, you're probably better at answering that question than I am. I mean, I did work for the U.S. government for my career before I retired, and sadly, I saw more of a progression towards it being about process and not so much about coming up with goals and actually moving conservation in a direction. So I'm not sure that I can speak to how easily the social scientists that actually are available within various governments can actually be moved into helping these conservation problems. Maybe you have a better perspective on that than I do. Sorry.
Thank you.
Okay, apparently we've got time for one more.
Hi, Barb. Thanks so much for your talk. I've always felt and thought we, as scientists and conservationists, we like to convey our passion and what drives us. But I found, say, in fisheries, for example, we don't tap into what drives the fisher, which is ultimately economic. So we need to be able to flip that script, maybe describe how, you know, whale poo is a fine example of how those services to the ocean equals more fish, but the first approach may need to be really tapping into what's driving those fishes, or, you know, or the like sort of thing, and looking at a more, you know, something that may be foreign to us, which is that nature provides, you know, beauty and a service to us, but to them it might be money is the first service to them. So
yeah, I'm sure that varies across the cultural landscape globally, and one of the points that was made in that Human Dimensions workshop was finding shared goals, you know, that promote both things, and that, I think, is a very important task. In some cases it's going to be economic benefits, and in some cases it's going to be cultural benefits, but that's a really important step.
Thank you very much. Please join me again in thanking Barb and Nick.